Here's my finished second part of my mold. Pretty smooth. If I do have a really rough surface or a lot of cleanup that I need to do along my edge, I can use one of these guys. This is called a Sureform, and they come in 3 different sizes. I have 2 of the sizes here. You can buy these at Home Depot, at Ace, at Lowe's. They also sell them at Harbor Freight Tools. This size is great for this project because it's small enough and it's slightly curved. Notice that the bottom is has a little bit of a curve to it. There's my second part. I'm going to let this set, and then I will come back and do the third part of my mold. Okay, we're back. So here are my 2 parts of my mold. I've taken my clay off, take out my pour spout, and you can see I've got 2 nice clean edges here. Just a tiny bit of cleanup to do around the outside of that edge. And notice that my 2 parts of my plaster are stuck together. Now, as long as I definitely put my Murphy's oil soap or Vaseline between the layers, I know that it'll come apart. But right now I want to leave it together. And the reason why I want to leave it together is it's really hard to get it to stick back together if it opens up. Now, if it does open up in the process of cleaning up and getting ready for the last part of my mold, it's not the end of the world. I can put a rubber band around in this direction to hold it together, but it's just a lot easier if it stays as one unit until I'm ready to open the whole thing up at the end. I do need to clean off the dried clay off the surface of the bulb because any little bit of texture on there will show up in my mold. So I'm going to need to use a little water or a sponge or a rag and just kind of gently wet that and wipe it off. So I'm just going to go and take a rag and wash this surface of my bulb off so it's nice and clean. Okay, so ready to do the third and final part of my mold. So the only thing I need to build now out of clay is the last part of my pour spout. You can see I've got 2 parts made here, and I just need to make the last part of my pour spout. You can see there's the opening for it where I'm going to pour into that little funnel. So I'm just going to take a little piece of my clay, bend that into my little funnel shape, and this time I've got to squeeze it into that little narrow space there. Okay, and then I just need to use some of the leftover clay to support this so it doesn't rock back and forth on my board. So I've got all this dirty clay I've used already twice now. Okay, that feels nice and sturdy. What do I need to remember to do? Your Murphy's oil soap or Vaseline. So I'm ready to do my last plaster part. So I will go get some water. Okay, just to walk through this once more, starting with clean, cold water. I don't want to use warm water, once again, because of the exothermic chemical reaction that plaster goes through. Scoop out some dry plaster. Never add water to plaster. Always add the plaster to the water. Hopefully by now you've watched this process 3 times and you have a good handle on doing this yourself. You can see there's plaster on the surface, but it's still working its way down and soaking into the water and disappearing. So I need to add more plaster. See the plaster slowly soaking in. Almost have an island. I try to put the plaster in around the outside edge as it tends to build up in the middle mostly, and I want to even that out. So there's my island. See how it's not immediately soaking in. It's staying dry on the surface. I'm going to put a little bit more in. Okay, so now I'm letting the plaster slake. Remember we mentioned that term earlier. Slaking is the process of the plaster absorbing into the water and starting to set up. I'll just demonstrate as an alternative. You can take a stick and you can stir it with a stick. So you just want to stir it until you don't feel any lumps anymore in there. You can tap it again to get some of the air bubbles to come up. Time to dribble away. So it's ready to go. Okay, tap it to even it out. Get the air bubbles out very gently. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm going to dribble a little bit more, and I want to make sure again to dribble all the way out to the edge of my mold. Okay, so I'm going to let this get a little bit thicker. I'm going to scrape my edges, taking my time. Now it's just getting to the point where it's not completely running off, so I can start to shape it a little bit. Again, always working from the middle, building up the middle so that I have that round shape of my bulb. Okay, so see how it's getting nice and rounded on the end there. Just going to continue to build up this larger part. Make it a little bit thicker, a little bit rounder. And then always working back along the edge to scrape off any excess. So I have less cleanup work to do at the very end. All right, I think that's good. There's the third and final part of my 3-part light bulb mold. We'll let that set for about 15-20 minutes until the plaster is hard, and then we're ready to take it all apart and see what it looks like on the inside. So here's our completed mold from last night, and then I need to pop it open. So in order to pop it open, I need to find my seam lines, which are covered a little bit. I can see a little bit of the crack right there. They're covered a little bit by the plaster that's spilled off the edge. So I'm going to take my fettling knife and I'm just going to scrape down that edge until I can see the entire seam line. Now, if you have a Surform, you can also use this. And I can start to see the seam line. You can see this line right along here where my mold sections come together. So I need to do that for all 3 of my seam lines. Oh, and there it goes. Popped right open. So there's my first part, my second and my third part. So now I can pop my light bulb right out. And notice that I have a little plaster spillage on the top where the pour spout is. So I'm just going to open that up. And I'm going to get rid of this little extra along the outside edge. Again, being very, very careful not to touch the surface of my mold cavity. There's one. Second one, I've got a little spillage there too. Just clean that up. Okay, now let's fit them back together and see what it looks like. So you can see these two fit right like that. And when I look at my seam line, notice that I don't have any big gaps or anything like that. Everything fits really, really cleanly together. Now I'm going to put my third piece in. And you can look, there's my pour spout. You can see everything fits nice and snugly. Now your mold is ready for casting. Okay, so we are ready to cast into our mold. And the first thing you want to do is make sure that the inside of our mold is nice and clean. You can rinse it out or use a paper towel or a cloth to gently wipe out the inside. The first thing we need to do is apply a mold release, just like we did along our walls to keep the different parts separated. We need to put a mold release on the inside of our mold cavity so that the plaster that we pour into our mold doesn't stick to our mold. Okay, so if you have your Vaseline, you can use that as your mold release agent. The problem with Vaseline is it's so thick and goopy that you have to be sure to put on a very, very thin coat of it. And I find if I use a brush to put Vaseline on, I end up with major brush strokes in the surface of my mold. So it works better to use like a paper towel or a rag to wipe off all the excess Vaseline. I like to use Murphy's Oil Soap again. The reason I like the Murphy's Oil Soap is it's a little bit thinner than the Vaseline. And while I do get some brush stroke marks, it tends to level out and even out pretty well. You want to make sure to put your mold release agent on every surface that you're going to pour into. So that includes your pour spout. Make sure you get it everywhere on your mold cavity. And I like to put a new coat on my parting lines as well, just in case I have a little plaster that seeps out along that parting line, then it doesn't stick to the mold. So I'm going to put a little bit along there. Make sure if you're using a cheap brush like this that you don't get any hairs from the brush left on the surface. Okay, that's pretty good. I'm going to let that even itself out, soak into the surface a little bit. I could take a paper towel and just gently wipe the surface to get rid of those brush strokes. But you don't want to wipe it too hard and wipe off all of your Murphy's Oil Soap. Okay, now my Murphy's Oil Soap is done and I'm ready to put my mold together and cast it. Okay, so I've put my mold together and I've used some rubber bands to hold it together. I put several up at the top here. I was able to double this one up. It's best if you have a really, really strong rubber band because you don't want this, see, I can put a little pressure on this and pop it open. And you don't want this to move and open up while you're casting it. Then all of your plaster will spill at the bottom and it'll be a big giant mess and you'll have to start over again. So you want to make sure this is nice and secure. Another thing you can use is duct tape or masking tape. If you don't have any rubber bands, you can wrap them around, or you can use any kind of string. Just tie it. Make sure to pull it really, really tight and snug. Especially something that's a little stretchy will work the best. And then you need something that's going to hold your mold upright. So because this has a round end, I need to somehow support it so it's standing upright. You could do that with some leftover clay if you have some leftover clay, or you can put it on a yogurt cup or in one of your buckets. You can see there it is, and it's pretty secure on that bucket. One other test that I like to do before I cast is to double check that there aren't any leaks to my mold, okay? The best way to do this, if you're not totally sure, is just to hold it up to the light and look into your mold. And so, I don't know if you can see what I'm doing here, just looking up, trying to hold it and look up into the mold. And just make sure that there aren't any holes. If there are any obvious spots where there's an imperfection and you can see a pinhole of light, even just the smallest pinhole, you're going to need to seal that up. The easiest way is just to take a little wet clay and cover the seam line where the hole is. Just push some clay into that spot. If it's a really glaring bad imperfection, if there's a big hole that really needs to be filled, you're going to need to mix up a little extra plaster and cover that part of your mold over with a little extra plaster. So now we're ready to mix up our plaster for casting. We're going to mix up the plaster in essentially the same way as before, but this time we're going to not mound up our island quite as much as we did, so that it's a little bit more runny and more pourable, so that we can get it to pour right down into our mold cavity. All right, so here we go. Start it again with fresh, clean water. And you do want to make sure that you mix up enough plaster to be able to cast this in one shot, because if you don't have enough, you're going to have a giant seam line in the middle of your cast light bulb. You can see my island here is soaking in, so we're still adding more plaster. By now you've done this at least 3 times, so hopefully by now you've pretty much mastered mixing plaster. Here's another island that's slowly soaking in. All right, I'm going to put just a little bit more plaster on the top. Almost done. So like I said, we're not going to mound it up quite as much this time in our island. So you can see I've got a dry island in the middle. It hasn't soaked into the water. You can still see the plaster on the surface, but it's moist. Except for the very center. All right, ready to mix. This plaster though, we're going to use it right away before it has a chance to start to set up, because we want it nice and runny. And I'm going to tap it a lot to get air bubbles to come out. Okay, time to set up for our pour. Okay, so you can see our mold is all set here. And I've got my plaster all mixed up. I'm going to pinch the edge of this so it has a nice thin pour spout. And I'm going to pour a very thin stream of plaster right down the middle. I want a nice thin stream because that gets all the air bubbles out as I'm pouring the plaster. Okay, so I poured right up to the top of my pour spout. Now I'm going to tap this again just to get any air bubbles out that happen to be trapped in there. It's most common to have air bubbles trapped in the threads of the mold at the top or on any little shoulder kind of spots. All right, so there's the top of my mold. You can see the plaster came all the way up to the top of the pour spout. And it's normal for it to start to shrink in a little bit and seep in. All right, now we've got to let that plaster set, and we're going to let it set a little bit longer, so we'll probably let it set for a couple hours before we demold our piece and open it up. All right, we're back and ready to open our mold. So I let this sit overnight just because it was late and that was the timing that I had. Probably good to let your plaster sit for at least an hour, a couple hours, so that it really has a chance to cure and you don't have any issues with it being a little bit soft still and weak and break. So you should be able to take your rubber bands off and pretty easily pop this right open if you've done everything correctly with your Murphy's Oil Soap. So sometimes you need to give a little pressure to it with a fettling knife to pop the mold open. There it goes. And you can see my light bulb in there. Be very gentle putting this down. Sides giving me a little trouble. Here we go. Look at that. It's a little light bulb. Now what happened here is plaster shrinks when it dries, and so this is why we usually cast it in wax. You have less chance of that happening when you make it in wax. There's my light bulb. Took a little bit of force to pop it out as the last part of my mold. Ended up using a soft mallet. This is a rawhide mallet for jewelry making. Overall, you can see it came up pretty cleanly. There we go.